Annette, welcome. Thank you so much for joining this conference. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to see you.
Thank you. I am honored as well. I hope we do some good out there.
Oh, yes, we will surely. To be honest, your books were one of those books where I discovered that storytelling is not a part of public speaking. Some people come up to me, even 5 years in, and say, Artem, you so cleverly took storytelling out of public speaking and made it a separate area. And I'm like, well, it wasn't me, and it was never a part of public speaking. So thank you so much for, helping me make this discovery that story practitioners make.
Yeah, well, it goes back to how I came to story myself
Tell me more
because
about
I had a difficult childhood and I didn't I wasn't I wasn't popular. And I so wanted to be popular. And so I was trying to figure out, how did these humans, and I think I may be a little on the spectrum, just how did these humans like decide to make a group? And I started studying psychology when I was 13 years old. I studied transactional analysis, which is the first pop psychology where you can be your own psychologist, kind of self-analyze. Rational emotive therapy. I learned transcendental meditation. Um, and this was because my father was a social worker and he would bring this knowledge to me. Well, even though he was a social worker, he didn't want me to be one. So he told me I could be a doctor, a lawyer, an architect, whichever one I want. And I had agreed to become a lawyer. And when I wanted to study psychology, because you listen to people's problems all the time, study marketing. And marketing is psychology, and it's more rigorous. If you're not good at it, you don't get to do it again out in the marketplace. And so that was the beginning of my career. So it was time for me to go to law school. I didn't want to go to law school, so I moved to Australia instead, which seemed like the only viable option, as opposed to telling my father I didn't want to go to law school. It was just easier to move to Australia. And I learned so much there. Because unless you've had your narrative challenged, you don't even know you have one. And so I went over the typical American with lots of opinions, and one of them being about work ethic. And so I thought play was a waste of time. And it was all about work, 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 work. And I also believed about self promotion. Well, in Australia, they have what they call the tall poppy syndrome. Those who rise above the rest get brought down. So I invited many scissors with my, hey, I'm Annette and I'm good at this. And I had to learn a different way. I had to learn a different narrative. The other thing was about work. If I'm judging all the people around me for taking 4-week vacations every year, that's not going to make me a good team player. And thank God I moved there because I began to understand that play and work actually are part of a paradox, where if you only do one or if you only do the other, then it doesn't work. But finding how to toggle back and forth is where the real answers are. And so this formative experience was the first time I realized that people have narratives. And of course, each culture has different narratives. And I learned what it's like to change your narrative. It's not fun. I mean, and so my work in helping people change narratives, one of the things that I try to bring to the work is a sense of deep compassion for how hard it is. Because I thought I was right when I moved over there about leisure and play and self-promotion. And you think you're right, but very often you're on one side of a paradox. And most of the cultural, I'm a big fan of Fons Trompenaar's work in cultural differences. I don't know if you're familiar. He wrote Writing the Waves of Culture. He has a database of 55,000 different dilemmas based on 20 years of research with culture. But what I find really interesting is that culture tends to aggregate around paradoxes that cannot be resolved. One would be work and play. Another would be individual versus group survival. And so we end up as cultures, because it's so hard to live in the middle, we just make it up that one's righter than the other. And so Americans, individual is more important than the group. Japan, group is more important than individual. And so what Fons Trompenaar discovered is that when you have cultural differences, you're usually around one of 7 paradoxes. Now, this was something I discovered after I did my work, research on territorial games. But the first thing I did was I asked people to tell me stories about turf wars. And so this translates into different languages in different ways. In German, the literal is mobbing, but there is not a culture that doesn't understand being elbowed out of the way or someone not sharing information or intimidation or any of the 10 games. What I learned is that usually when people are playing territorial games with each other, they're on opposite sides of a paradox. I didn't know that when I wrote the book. When I wrote the book, mainly I knew that stories cause people to think about what you want them to think about. And so I told, instead of telling stories about why we need to collaborate, I would tell stories about how we get triggered and don't collaborate. And I also promised the people, and I've presented this for 30 years in the room, that it is completely natural. It's your instinct to be territorial. And so it's not your fault. And they're like feeling really good about that. And I said, and also, it's not their fault either. We're all human beings. We have these territorial instincts. And we also have the capacity to rise right above the instincts. What bothers me right now about our current situation is that tacticians who want to sow disinformation and violence have clued in to these paradoxes. And so they're producing stories that make it look like that, you know, the individual is the most important. How can you be an idiot? And of course, those stories are true. But there's also stories about how capitalism is, you know, vile, evil, and greedy. And those stories are true too. And so one of the things that I've come to realize is that it is a competitive narrative, A versus B, that causes our divisiveness, and that each one can find rationale because they're right. Both sides of the paradox are right. So the way I teach it is so if you want to live, then you have to make a decision about whether you want to breathe in or breathe out, right? I mean, it's one or the other. And so I'll have people breathe in. I'll say, okay, now you should be done. Well, you have a new problem? What's your problem? Oh, you want to breathe out now? Oh, I see. Because it's both and. And so when we can experience with our body this breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, it teaches us how to handle paradoxes, because it is in the middle where we toggle back and forth. And right now, a lot of stories demonize those in the middle. as being not right on this way and not right on this way because they're in the middle.
Oh,
I'm gonna pause because I've just you asked me what's interesting next.
yeah, everything. That's the first answer. I like how you come to story and narrative by experiencing these paradoxes yourself, and that gives me a lot of information on how do you see them in the people you work with. But what I see is when people breathe in and breathe out, which is a great way of experiencing paradox inside of you, it's easy for them to recognize that there are paradoxes. But I believe maybe that's wrong, that breathing in and breathing out is easier than putting yourself in the shoes of somebody on the other end of the spectrum. So could you tell me a bit more on which paradoxes it is essential to work with currently, and what are the ways that people can breathe out who have been breathing in these paradoxes?
Let me give you a little trick that I use in corporate work. And one of the paradoxes is the paradox of freedom versus structure. And of course, we're tearing ourselves apart about that in the United States right now and everywhere else. Structure, authoritarianism, and freedom. Okay, so what I do is I put a grid pattern, 4 boxes on a whiteboard, and on top of one I say freedom, and then on top of the other I say structure. And so I ask the group to tell me, so what are the advantages of freedom? And I make them list them because this is how I evoke stories from the group as often as I would tell stories from the group, because they trust their stories better because they were there. And so a time when you had plenty of freedom, creativity, psychological safety, and then you had at some point too much freedom, didn't you? Did you ever, what happens when you have too much freedom? So I get them to say, well, it's chaos and we waste resources. And I say, okay, so what do you need? Well, we need structure. I said, okay, what are the good things about adding structure? So you can see where I'm going with this. But what I'm doing is I'm taking them through their own stories in their own mind while I remind this of this, you can use freedom and structure in just about any circumstance. Different cultures are different, but I also have the idea of the paradox as an infinity circle. And so viewing it as an infinity circle, what I do is I have to make each side feel safe with me or with the group we're in. Now, granted, that's not as easy on Twitter but I still do it. I still run my experiments. So I validate their point of view first. So I have 6 kinds of stories. And by the way, storytelling is our evolutionary software for behavior to keep us from killing each other. And all these stories that have been passed down have lessons that show that the short-term consequences aren't near as bad as the long-term consequences. And that's one thing story does really well. It expands the frame of reference. And so what we have with these 2 sides is they have their own frame of reference. And so the 6 stories that I teach is, who are you? Why are you here? Values in action, teaching stories, vision stories, and I know what you're thinking stories. So I use I know what you're thinking stories. So I will tend to validate this person first. Say, I really appreciate how you see that individual motivation can be spurred on by competition. I really, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I used to think that way, actually, and this is true. I used to be the task-oriented action plan queen. I could bring a group into a room and facilitate the heck out of it until they're all in this little corral called agreement, and they have their task and they have the date it's supposed to be done. And I mean, I was good at that. The problem is that people aren't cows. So after the meeting, they open the gate and they go back to wherever the hell they were in the first place. Well, one of the things that I learned is when I'm communicating with someone, I have to validate their opinion first. I have to show respect. And when I show respect, we can connect. This is a little story happened to me the other day. I was taking Katie for a walk, and I live in an all Black neighborhood. I like it this way. Diversity is very important to me. So, but my neighbors don't feel the same way necessarily. And so one of my neighbors, Katie had pooped on his yard, but I carry bags. I always pick it up. And he didn't have any grass anyway. And so I go to pick it up and he goes, "Don't you let your dog poop on my yard anymore." I said, "I pick it up." He said, "I don't care. The enzymes, they attack the grass." And I said, "You know what I think?" And he said, "What?" I said, "I think this is your house and this is your lawn, and you get to decide what does and doesn't happen on it. So I won't, it won't happen again, I promise." If you notice, there's a little bit of a dance there instead of automatically getting my back up. And one of the things that in order for us to help people at polarities, we have to help them relax a little bit. And humor is very important. When I do the 10 territorial games, they're all funny stories because, we act like idiots when we get triggered like that. And so everybody's laughing and all that sort of stuff. And so I have to keep my equanimity so that I can bring it to the relationship of this person. Online, as a female, I get attacked a lot. And I've actually written a book about gender as well. And so I there was an article in New York Times about using firm language, about being clear and authoritative. And my comment was, that's total rot, because there are times when provisional language is a way to bring someone closer to you. So instead of saying, "I know what your problem is," which is basically, a lot of consultants will do that. I will ask questions. And I use language that is provisional. So instead of "what that means is," I'll use language that is, so what it might mean is. And so this article was saying that was weak. It's not weak, it's an invitation to collaboration. It's a sign of humility. And humility works as long as it's not weakness. Weakness is not humility. True humility is dignity. So being able to say it might have been dignity. So dignity for me is you understand your value as a human being and other people's value as a human being. We don't call the jerks dignified. We call Nelson Mandela dignified. So, okay, provisional language, descriptive language, instead of saying, "So you're angry. Why are you angry?" Say, "I noticed that you tensed up your fists. Can you explain what just happened here?" Let's see, what's the other one? Oh, equality versus superiority. Instead of me acting like I'm inferior or acting like I'm superior, I speak to people as equals. it has a dramatic difference. It's comes from transactional analysis. You can be a parent, an adult, or a child. So you speak as an adult. So these are some of the things that I use to woo those who are probably miserable being stuck with the right answer and nobody listens.
Interesting. So let me get that straight. From your point of view, as a facilitator, as a leader of the group, as this host, you are using these kind of, shifts to might and to equal communication, which is great. What I noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, you elicit stories about moments when people got triggered by being in their side of the spectrum. For example, too authoritarian or too individual. Is that right? Or did I miss something?
It's part, that's one of my tools, is that I make sure both sides of the polarity is on. And it didn't really matter which side that room is balanced towards. Almost everybody comes up with their own conclusions. And one of the beauties of storytelling is that we narrate a story and then we allow them to come to their own conclusions. We don't tell them what to think. And story is a very egalitarian way to bring up an aspect or context that has been ignored. Sometimes people get really angry. I've facilitated between Christian groups and who think homosexuality is a sin, and homosexuals. So my experience was with a lot of polarities. And one of the stories that came back from that is there was a big church meeting with like 25 different churches, and it's the UCC, and I facilitated between them when they were trying to decide whether to stay together, because a lot of the rural churches were what they call faith-based, Bible-based, and a lot of the churches in the city were open and affirming. So here's this 25 church gathering, and the choir from the open and affirming church, with obviously gay people in the choir, started to sing, and it was beautiful. And God bless him, some man so threatened by homosexuality or whatever yelled, "Don't let these people work their way into your hearts." And so I see pain there. I do see the anger, but there's pain underneath it. And so for me, holding my narrative about the people who are trying to make a polarity into a single solution, either way, they're scared, because paradox is scary. We have over emphasized certainty. Certainty is something that humans crave. We want to know that tomorrow is going to be, if not the same as today, we want to know it's going to be what we want it to be. And the unpredictability of collaboration means that transactional, so on LinkedIn, for instance, I get approached by people who say, I'll promote you if you promote me. Like, I'm here to make friends. And when it's transactional, I don't feel like you're my friend. So I hunt out people who I feel an affinity with, and make friends. But the rise of social media has overemphasized this transactional nature, where if I give you something, I want to know what you're going to give me back. Storytelling, particularly the original hero story, supports and validates that giving, being generous, being kind, is something that may or may not get paid back by the person involved. And if we think it's automatic, then we tend to shut down how often we show generosity and graciousness and collaboration. So the hero at the beginning of the original hero story, certainly the Jack Tales, wanders out from home going to the unknown without enough provisions, usually. Doesn't have enough to eat, doesn't have money. He runs across the first needy character, a poor beggar man who's starving and shares half his food. Now that guy's never going to pay him back, and he doesn't know where he's going to get food in the future. But his faith in reciprocity causes him to be kind, and it starts the virtuous spiral. So the second person that he runs across, maybe it's a bird that has been hurt, and he nurses it back to health. And then the third, in some stories in Ivan, they're all wizards disguised as birds, so a falcon. And it's not until the end of the story, where the hero is just about to lose his life, that he gets saved by these people he's been generous to in the past. And so reciprocity is something that's only story can teach, because only a story can link these non-transactional acts of generosity to it's ultimately good for all of us. And so one of the things that I'll go back to, story being evolution's behavior modification system, these stories have been sliced and diced to where you don't get to see these lessons in reciprocity, because it's not high action, not until the end. And we have to retell these stories, otherwise we can't maintain our faith in the goodness of others, and thus can't maintain our own goodness as example for others.
So what I'm hearing is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, and if I'm simplifying it also, please do let me know.
No.
If one of the things that we can do is eliciting stories where people feel they are triggered by stepping out of the paradox, so they can see there is a paradox, there is another side. And the other major story that has to be told, and
hang on, elicit stories, but make sure you have both sides represented.
Of
right?
course.
Set it up that way. Otherwise, once you elicit stories, you can't get to the other side. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and I if I'm guessing correctly, the both sides are telling about their experience, and it's like connecting in the middle. And the one more major thing is sharing and eliciting stories of these long connections. But I'm not quite sure, how do these stories of, reciprocity link to the paradox theme? Do they help us see the paradox?
So I do what I call a mindset, a preempt, and then an engagement. And so the mindset, I will tell a story. I have a couple of stories, but the easiest to recount here is the African story about the two brothers who lived on either side of the road. And one time a stranger came by, and that night at dinner, because they shared dinner together, they argued because one brother said that the hat the stranger was wearing was black, and the other brother said it was red. And they argued and argued and argued until they stopped speaking. And it was like a week later when the stranger leaves the village and comes back. And so each brother says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It was red. No, it was black." And the stranger's hat was half red and half black. And so that would be what I call a mindset. Say almost all of our problems, when we are get to a standoff, are going to be a function of some kind of polarity we don't understand yet. So I set that up as the mindset. So now that's what they're looking for. Then I would do the let's have stories about both sides, about the goodness of both sides. And then let's have stories about where, both sides can go a little overboard. And sometimes I have to supply the story. It depends on how much time you have with a client. It's faster for me to supply the stories because I have them, but it's more effective for them to supply the stories. And so all of the techniques that I use in storytelling are to validate, to create psychological safety, and to encourage vulnerability as, an act of courage. I do have a few tricks. One is I'm getting them to tell stories before they even realize they're telling stories. I don't ask them to share stories. I ask them to share an episode they remember where adding freedom really made a difference. And sharing an episode, my definition of story is significant emotional event, because it spells SEE, which in English is see. So what I love is that we are enlarging people's context. We're not trying to take their context away, ever. Not telling them they're wrong. You're right, and this side is right too. And so now let's understand this battle as and then I introduce the narrative of competition, because in a battle, one side's going to win. And that doesn't work with a paradox, because it's disastrous for all freedom all the time, or all structure all the time. And so once I get them aware that they've been trained to think that there's a right and wrong answer, that there are two answers to paradoxes, and always at least two, then we've moved into a place where they have opened up their interpretation, because it just makes sense. I mean, you tell the story about the red hat, black hat, these are what I call big T truths. Little T truths are facts, and they're true within their context. But in my world, big T truths are things that were true before you and I were born, and they're going to be true long after we're gone. And that's paradox. Big T truths almost always in my world. And I recommend the 7 dilemmas of von Trompenaar's work. So he has self versus individual, cultures, universality versus specificity. That's an easy one to see in corporate worlds. And I introduce it to people in corporate worlds. And then they get a chance to see how they've been kind of structured to believe one versus the other. So in HR, universality, which is everybody gets treated the same. We have pay grades, and that's how we make sure it's fair. Well, people out in the field, they may have a star performer who's not old enough, hasn't been with the company long enough, but if they don't give them a raise, they're going to lose them. So that's specificity. That's like, you can't use one size fits all the time, because that's stupid. So people in the field, and my mentor, Jim Farr, taught me to make predictions that come true as a consultant. And so when we, as consultants or story sharers, we introduce the idea of these paradoxes, Once they investigate the world of that story, then they began to realize that there are two truths here. We may be running out of time. I have the story I want to tell is something is an example, and I'm not going to be able to do it service because we don't have time, but it's about a blind man in a tribe who marries a warrior princess, and her warrior brother hates the idea that this man is blind and thinks he's weak. And so he has to take him hunting because of obligation. And as they're on the trail, the blind man hears danger and avoids elephants that are, running across. And ultimately, they get to the place where they are going to set a trap for a bird, because what they really want are the colored feathers. And the colored feathers, it depends on what your trap looks like as to whether you're going to get that bird. And so the blind man sets his trap, and his brother-in-law covers up his trap really well with camouflage, and doesn't do such a good job with the blind brother-in-laws. Well, they come back out, and the brother-in-law sees that the blind man's trap is the one with the colorful bird. And so he puts that bird in his pocket, and he says, "Oh, brother-in-law, poor thing, you only have a little brown bird." They're walking back and just nattering on. He says, "Why do, they're fighting in the tribe about all these things. Why do people fight?" And the blind man says, "Because they do to each other what you have just done to me." And after a long time, he says, "I'm sorry. Please accept my apologies." And then he goes back to talking about the village, and he says, what makes people get along together?" He says, "When they do what you have just done to me."
Oh, this is beautiful. Is this a story that brings it to the engagement part, or is it like...
Well, this story does two things.
Mhm.
People think they're getting away with it. People who are using other people think nobody notices because nobody calls them out on it. They know. Everybody around you knows that if you're an exploitative, dominant, unempathetic person, you think you're getting away with it, but you're not. You're not. And it's not improving your relationships. And if you want to have relationships, if you want to be less lonely, if you want to feel part of something bigger than yourself, then it's important to understand that even those things you think people can't see, they see. They know.
Love it. Oh, this is a great way to illuminate the space in between. I almost see how two lighthouses first light the path in between them, and then slowly light each other as if they are coming out of the darkness instead of lighting the opposite directions.
That's a nice image. That's a really nice image.
Thank you for bringing it up. I have just one final question, since we're short on time. You've been a story practitioner for many years and you've taught many people, but I believe this approach you've just shared is resonating with many participants of our conference. It will for sure, because it resonates with me. What advice would you give to somebody who is only beginning their journey in story and paradox to get into this field and help others around them see the middle ground?
I recommend the ancient stories. When I started studying storytelling, I studied with traditional storytellers who tell the old traditional tales. Personal narrative is great. I love it. I do it all the time. But I have a bookshelf of stories from Hungary, from Switzerland, from Asia. I mean, these stories help me understand the depth of storytelling. Now, you don't feel like you're getting anywhere fast, but once you ground yourself in the narratives, and they are not just a monomyth, it's not just the hero story, these are very complex narratives of reciprocity, then you're going to come up with so many creative ideas. And really telling one of those stories well is the best way to prompt people to want to tell their own story. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
makes perfect sense.
Go to the old stuff.
I'm almost it feels as if I was at the spectrum of personal stories, and now I see that there's the other side of traditional tales, which don't sound so stupid and old and outdated anymore. Thank you for showing this.
May everybody feel the same way. Yes, there's wonderful stories out there.
Oh, I hope they will do. And thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for bringing your light.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And if people want to get in touch with me, I'm at Annette@AnnetteSimmons.com. And I enjoy meeting new friends.
Perfect. I will leave your link in the chat.
Okay.
So thank you so much once again.
Okay. Take care. Bye. Bye, everybody.
I hope you guys enjoyed this recording of Annette sharing her wisdom on lighting the middle ground. And we actually have a tradition going. I have a question that I'm asking every speaker to answer. The question goes like this: a lighthouse can show us where the danger is, but a group of lighthouses can guide us through dangerous waters. What story would you like more people to tell? Because we need more stories, more people sharing these stories. And here's what Annette answers to this, and I think you'll like it. It's on us to carve time from tending to our own well-being in order to tend to our collective survival. Since it is a paradox, we must face the fact that there are trade-offs. Ancient stories that celebrate acts of self-sacrifice, generosity, long-term thinking, and the dangers of arrogance and greed are waiting to do their job again. These are the stories that can light our way. For me, it was really a beautiful answer that resonates with her talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now we will be moving forward. Our next speaker